The day Imperial Admiral Richard returned from the dead, the entire capital erupted in a frenzy. Yet Logan, the little widower, forced into a ghost marriage to honor his memory, stood paralyzed in the crushing shadows of the crowd, his skin crawling with absolute dread. The starship touched down, radiating a terrifying, inescapable magnetism that instantly froze the surrounding light into a ghastly white frost. The man stepped out of the hatch like a ruthless tyrant, meeting his supposedly dead husband's freezing, lethal gaze. A devastating flush of pure terror rushed to the corners of Logan's eyes. His trembling fingertips gripped the hem of his trench coat in a death hold. Right beneath that fabric, the slight curve of his 3-month pregnancy gave a sudden, restless flutter. Main text: the news of Imperial Admiral Richard's resurrection from the dead struck like a freezing aurora, instantly piercing the stagnant night of the capital. Outside the heavy obsidian gates of the Williams estate, holographic projections looped the medals of the returning hero. Guards leaned against the cold, embossed metal pillars, their hushed whispers scattering in the biting wind. The Omega he was originally engaged to is crying her eyes out, yet that low-grade trash inside gets to reap all the benefits. Just watch. How could a ruthless, iron-blooded alpha like the Admiral ever tolerate a powerless, nobody Omega taking up that spot? He'll probably be thrown out on the street tonight. Inside the floor, 2 ceiling windows. The pale grey moonlight was refracted by the nano-glass into dismal patches of color, stretching long twisted shadows across the floor. Logan stood in the dark, his trembling fingertips lifting the thin silk of his shirt. In the full-length mirror, his lower abdomen carried a slight curve. A silver silk ribbon bit ruthlessly into his tender waist, desperately trying to conceal a terrifying secret. That pale pink pregnancy mark, rubbed raw and crimson by the coarse fabric, looked exceptionally striking against his ghostly pale skin. Logan's mind went entirely blank. If Richard had been at the border this entire time, then over these past few months, in the dead of every high tide night, who was the man slipping into his room? The man who entangled with him so fiercely, kissing him until his very soul shuddered. The deafening roar of engines tore through the dead silence. Several pitch-black, heavy lev-armored vehicles hovered to a steady stop, kicking up a gust of air heavy with inescapable domination. Richard stepped out of the vehicle. His long black trench coat whipped violently in the freezing wind, like the wings of a hawk tearing through the sky. He swept a freezing gaze over his surroundings, a lethal, battlefield-hardened ruthlessness permanently etched into his brow. The exact second Richard stepped into the hall, the surrounding air seemed disrupted by some high-frequency magnetic field. The light and shadows in their line of sight began to warp and vibrate eerily, as if the very space was fracturing into countless heavy dark shards just from his existence. Admiral, this low-grade Omega was shoved onto us by the higher-ups when they thought you had fallen in the line of duty. We will make him disappear immediately. Catching the gaze Richard threw toward Logan, the attendant beside him scrambled, desperate to shove that slender eyesore of a figure out of the way. Logan submissively lowered his eyelashes, masking the violent turbulence in his eyes. This was for the best. As long as he could avoid this man, the secret of carrying a bastard child with an unknown father could be buried forever. Who is he? Richard's voice was as deep as rolling thunder at the bottom of the ocean. His name is Logan. A low-grade Omega. Well, have him leave right now. Logan turned to leave, but the very moment they brushed past each other, a large, sharply defined hand layered with faint calluses locked onto his waist without a single warning. Richard's grip possessed an irresistible magnetism, yanking his entire body straight into the embrace of that trench coat, still carrying the lingering heat of gunfire. Instantly, the terrifying shudder of being targeted by a massive beast swept through his entire body. Richard looked down at him, his jawline pulled tight into a lethal curve. The Omega matched to me. And you want to just throw him out? The attendants fell silent as the grave, swiftly retreating. The alloy doors let out a heavy, muffled thud behind them. In the dead silence of the room, Logan tried to break free from that scolding, inescapable hold. But right at that moment, his lower abdomen, tightly bound by the silk ribbon, suddenly gave a sudden, unprompted kick. It was the unborn child reacting to an unfamiliar, utterly destructive alpha presence. Logan's breathing instantly froze, his fingertips digging fiercely into the hem of his shirt. Through the thin fabric, that distinct flutter of life struck precisely against Richard's broad palm. Richard's hand lingered over that curve for a moment, his brows knitted deeply in confusion, a dark gleam flashing in the depths of his eyes. Just when Logan thought he was about to be executed on the spot by this ruthless admiral, Richard slowly parted his lips. His tone carried an absurd kind of seriousness. "How did you get so chubby?" Logan froze. Before he could even process it, the fingers resting against his stomach pressed down slightly. "Your stomach is jumping. Are you starving?" To play along with this ridiculous excuse, Logan had no choice but to sit at the massive metal dining table. Under Richard's scrutinizing gaze, he fought down the nauseating waves of morning sickness, mechanically swallowing plate after plate of exorbitant delicacies. Richard sat right in that thick, almost tangible shadow. His fingertips tapped silently against the armrest, a spine, chilling, wicked curve tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Aren't you afraid it'll eat your estate into bankruptcy?" Suppressing the violent churning in his stomach, Logan looked up, meeting those abyssal eyes. "Eat." Richard's tone was freezing, yet laced with an obsessive, absolute certainty of claiming his prey. "The Admiral's estate can afford to feed you." The night grew impossibly thick, looking as if it were ready to swallow the entire manor whole. Logan and the ruthless Admiral lay on opposite sides of the same massive velvet bed. He curled up rigidly, deliberately slowing his breaths. The fabric band cutting into his stomach felt like a lethal noose, constantly reminding him of his status as a low-grade Omega and his unspeakable secret. Logan gripped the edge of the blanket in a vice. His eyelashes trembled as he desperately faked the steady breathing of a deep sleep, just when he thought he would be crushed by the boundless terror. An incredibly rich, yet unusually restrained alpha pheromone suddenly saturated the air. It was a unique scent, a blend of freezing fur and gunpowder. Like an undercurrent surging from the deep sea, it quietly, seamlessly cocooned him. Miraculously, Logan's tense spine began to relax. Soothed by the pheromones, he plunged into a bizarre, kaleidoscopic dream. The manor in his dream was terrifyingly dead silent. A towering alpha, covered in crimson, tore through the dark night like an asura from hell. His eyes were a blazing red, carrying a feverish obsession teetering on the brink of losing all control, locking dead onto Logan. "Who are you?" Logan shrank back into the corner of the bed in sheer panic. In a heavily fortified manor, how could there be an intruder? Could it be the dead Richard turning into a vengeful ghost? Before he could even wrap his head around it, that overwhelming, violent wave of pheromones aggressively invaded his senses, inescapably triggering an Omega's most primal, feverish heat. "Are you a ghost or not?" Logan's voice was stained with a tearful tremor. No answer. Only a ruthless, predatory kiss that ground all his resistance into shattered, muffled whimpers. That night felt like a hallucination, but the aching in his bones and the few black feathers scattered on the floor told Logan it was entirely real. He never expected the intruder to be so insanely bold. He actually broke into the Admiral's estate a second time. The second he arrived, Logan pressed a knife to his throat. The night was too dark to make out a face. He could only put up a tough front and demand, "Are you a man or a ghost?" With a single glance, the man noticed the slight, uncovered curve of Logan's stomach. His gaze darkened immensely. "You've been eating well." The exact moment Logan drove the knife into his chest, the man left a crimson splatter, biting a vicious mark into Logan's neck like a brutal punishment. After that, Logan's vision gradually blurred. As the knife slipped from his hand and clattered to the floor, the man bit down on Logan's ear, dropping his voice into a dark whisper. "Just pretend I'm a ghost, baby. Don't ever think about escaping me. A ghost. There is a ghost." Logan convulsed awake from the nightmare, cold sweat soaking his thin undershirt. He violently snapped his eyes open, only for his gaze to crash unexpectedly into a pair of abyssal, impossibly dark eyes. Richard was leaning halfway over him, his hand still frozen in the motion of tucking him in. Smack. The crisp, sharp sound of a slap exploded in the quiet bedroom. Logan stared blankly at his own trembling hand, then looked at the red handprint slowly surfacing on Richard's brutally cold cheek. Terror instantly seized his heart in a vice, stopping his breath dead. Yet, Richard didn't fly into a violent rage. He simply lowered his eyelids, a spine, chilling, dark emotion churning in his pitch, black pupils. His Adam's apple bobbed, his voice terrifyingly hoarse. "Where is the ghost?" Logan curled himself into a tight ball in pure panic, his voice trembling beyond recognition. "No, there's no ghost. I just had a nightmare." The air stagnated for several suffocating seconds. Suddenly, Richard leaned down, closing the distance with an aura of inescapable domination. Logan squeezed his eyes shut in absolute despair, but the expected punishment never fell. An incredibly light, nearly temperature, less kiss landed softly on his forehead. The butler has prepared the meal. Leaving behind that completely flat, emotionless sentence, Richard turned and walked away, the hem of his trench coat catching a cold draft. As the door clicked shut, Logan collapsed weakly onto his pillow as if completely drained. He instinctively reached for his lower abdomen. The silk band had been loosened. Not only that, but the pale pink pregnancy mark on his waist had now turned a striking, engorged crimson. It looked as if it had been ruthlessly sucked and bitten, standing out shockingly against his pale skin. The growth of a fetus would absolutely never leave a mark like that. Logan was a nervous wreck the entire day. To avoid the suffocating master bedroom, he wandered aimlessly through the manor. But as he passed the half-open carved wooden doors of the study, his footsteps nailed dead to the floor. An unfamiliar male voice drifted from inside. "Are you seriously going to keep that Omega? Hez holding a secret that could completely ruin you. Then what do you suggest I do?" Richard's voice was as cold as solid ice. Obviously, the man made a throat-slitting gesture. "Make him shut up forever." "Wait, Richard? What the hell are you laughing at?" Peering through the crack in the door, Logan's pupils contracted violently. Richard sat behind the massive mahogany desk, his fingertips idly spinning a freezing military dagger. On that face that was permanently devoid of emotion, a twisted, incredibly eerie spine, chilling smirk, was currently carving its way across his lips. Nothing. Richard parted his thin lips, his deep voice carrying a lethal hooking edge. "I was just thinking about the little surprise my Omega secretly prepared behind my back. I'm just happy. What would a bachelor without an Omega like you know about it?" Logan clamped his hands tightly over his mouth, stifling a scream as he stumbled frantically back to his bedroom. A surprise. What surprise? The surprise of wearing a green hat. That thug covered in blood. Could it really have been Richard himself? Was that why he smiled like a total psycho? Because he was overjoyed that Logan was pregnant with his seed? No, he had to confirm this. If that thug was Richard, he would definitely have the stab wound Logan gave him in self-defense that night. The next morning, faint dawn light filtered through the sheer curtains. Taking advantage of Richard's deep sleep, Logan's trembling fingertips slowly, carefully peeled open the collar of his pajamas. The cold white chest was rock, solid and muscular, the sharp lines of his physique like a perfect sculpture. Right over his heart, it was completely smooth. Not a single scar. It wasn't him. Logan couldn't tell if the sudden, overwhelming wave washing over him was relief or a crushing disappointment. Just as he was about to close the collar, his wrist was violently seized by a cast iron grip. "What are you looking for?" Richard had opened his eyes at some unknown point. Those eyes were clear and razor, sharp, devoid of even a sliver of sleepiness. Driven by sheer guilt, Logan's brain instantly short-circuited. A frantic flush of red surfaced at the corners of his eyes. The next second, the world spun. With a single hand, Richard flipped him onto the bed, his towering frame covering him with terrifying, inescapable domination. Pinning Logan's flailing hands with one hand, he violently yet deftly used a silk ribbon to tie them securely to the brass headboard. Logan struggled in pure terror. Richard leaned in close. His warm breath brushed against Logan's ear, feeling almost tangible, yet his voice dropped ice. "Don't you have anything to confess to me? You're so terrified of me. Did you remember something?" Or, I don't know anything, Logan screamed, cutting him off, his chest heaving violently. Is that so? The fingers gripping his jaw tightened fiercely, forcing him to look up. If you don't have anything to say, why are you shaking? Following his jawline, the freezing pad of his thumb slid downward, stopping at Logan's fragile collarbone, snaking across his skin like a venomous viper. Baby, you're in such a panic. Did you do something to betray me, or are you simply trying to seduce me? As he spoke, those fingers had already hooked onto the edge of his collar. Just 1 inch lower, and the swelling of his stomach and that striking pregnancy mark would be completely exposed. Admiral! Bang! A heavily perspiring adjutant crashed through the door. Richard's movement stopped dead, his fingers hovering 1/2 inch above Logan's stomach. The murderous intent in his eyes looked ready to flay the adjutant alive. Get the hell out. The adjutant scrambled backward in absolute terror, his voice shaking uncontrollably. It's the medical team sent by the higher-ups. They're already in the main hall. The air pressure in the room plummeted below freezing. Richard slowly straightened up, looking down from an insurmountable height at the pale, disheveled Omega on the bed. His gaze scraped across Logan's stomach like a blade. You ate too much yesterday, and your stomach is still bloated? A ruthless, cruel curve hooked the corner of Richard's mouth. Tomorrow, I'll have the doctor take a look at you and see if you're suffering from indigestion. Despair washed over Logan like a freezing tide, instantly drowning him. The very second the heavy metal door clicked shut, Logan frantically tore his wrists free from the silk ribbon. His slender, red, marked wrists trembling slightly. He stared dead at Peter, the young guard who had been hastily summoned, sweat still dotting his forehead. He was the only person who had ever shown Logan a shred of kindness. Without a single wasted word, Logan pulled open his loose collar. The previously hidden curve of his belly, and that jarring corset band digging deeply into his flesh, were exposed completely to the air without reservation. Peter's pupils contracted violently as he inhaled a sharp breath of cold air. Take me away. The corners of Logan's eyes were flushed with tears. He looked like a trapped beast at the end of its rope. Or I will die by Richard's hands. This incomprehensible buy one, get one free situation made the young guard's brain freeze for several seconds. But looking at Logan's pale, fragile face, he ultimately swallowed all his questions. His face flushing red, he gave a heavy nod. The afternoon sun was sliced into cold, rigid bars by the blinds, projecting across Logan's face. Less than an hour before the speech, Richard's towering silhouette stormed into the room like a god of death, almost blocking out all the light. The faint sound of the man's military boots crushing the carpet sounded exactly like a countdown to execution. You and that guard named Peter. Are you very close? Richard's freezing fingers forcefully clamped onto Logan's jaw, the gun calluses on his thumb violently scraping the delicate skin. As his mood plummeted, the light and shadow in the room began to eerily distort. Countless tendrils of dark gray fog, like bloodthirsty vines with physical form, frantically crawled up the walls, squeezing every last drop of air from the surroundings. I've already had him transferred away. Richard leaned down, the shadows completely swallowing Logan. Even the butler said you never remember names. Yet, he was the one person you specifically asked to see alone. Logan's eyelashes fluttered violently, tears spinning in his eyes. He bit down hard on his lower lip, squeezing out a tear, stained rebellious cry from his throat. I hate you. Richard's movement suddenly halted. A flash of utter bewilderment and hurt, one he didn't even recognize himself, crossed the depths of his eyes. But the emotion vanished in a microsecond, instantly replaced by an even more violent, dominating pressure. You hate me, do you? Richard's voice dropped terrifyingly low, like a freezing blade pressed against an eardrum. If you won't behave, I don't mind letting someone else teach you some manners. Do you know how they amuse themselves in the black market? Making an Omega sit on a rough hemp rope and slowly slide forward, inch by inch? That maliciously whispered threat sent Logan's blood rushing backward. He clamped his legs tightly together, his pale fingertips digging fiercely into the bedsheets. Forced to expose his fragile neck, he swallowed all his terror, putting on his most flawlessly obedient facade. Engines roared as a pitch-black mag, Lev Sedan tore through the afternoon defense perimeter, speeding away under Peter's cover. At the exact same moment, in the Imperial Central Plaza, holographic projections magnified Richard's razor, sharp face to 100 feet tall, regarding the peace treaty with the Beastman Forest. Right in the middle of this intensely solemn moment, the adjutant, his face ghastly pale, rushed onto the high platform and urgently whispered into Richard's ear. In sheer terror, the translator's arm violently bumped the fader for the all-channel broadcast. The speaker matrix erupted with a piercing screech of static. Immediately after, that desperate report was magnified countless times. It transformed into a tangible, overpowering shockwave of sound, shattering the water curtain of the central fountain. Admiral, your wife ran off with another man? Ran off. Ran off. The echo violently detonated across the steel jungle, lingering endlessly. Inside the fleeing vehicle, the AC was blasted to the absolute lowest setting. Logan buried his entire face in the blanket, shivering so hard his teeth chattered. He thought this was the nationwide kill order issued by that petty, iron-blooded admiral, preferring to publicly wear a green hat just to hunt him down. A few days later, in a dark, cramped, safe house, Logan curled up in a nest, built from old clothes, panting in agony. The feverish flush of his heat spread all the way down his neck, cold sweat soaking his hair. Peter stood helplessly to the side, holding a cup of water. Give it to me. Logan lunged forward, violently pinning the young alpha to the floor. With hot, damp breaths laced with begging, his trembling fingers grabbed Peter's collar. Why aren't your pheromones working? Can you even do this? Peter's eyes grew red. He stuttered, shrinking backward. My scent. The second I get close, the baby in your stomach rejects it. I'm afraid of hurting you. I only secretly kissed you once. Does that get you pregnant too? The air went dead silent. Logan froze. He let go, staring at this young guard whose eyes held nothing but pure, unadulterated stupidity. The evil ghost who tormented him half to death in the dead of night, who pushed him to the absolute edge, could absolutely never be this idiot who didn't even grasp basic biology. The child wasn't Peter's. The cold glow of the phone screen illuminated Logan's deathly pale face. He mechanically swiped through the interface, pressing the final confirmation button for the abortion surgery. Since it wasn't Peter's, this bastard child absolutely could not be kept. However, the rainy night, he pushed open the battered iron door of the safe house, ready to rush to the clinic. That was exactly when he unexpectedly crashed into the real bastard. In the dim alleyway, the rain mixed with the heavy scent of rusted iron and overwhelmingly powerful alpha pheromones, stabbing straight into Logan's nasal cavity. It was an incredibly aggressive scent, teetering on the absolute edge of an uncontrollable rut. It was far too familiar. Logan froze in place. His gaze cut through the curtain of rain, locking dead onto the man collapsed next to the dumpster. The man was curled up in agony, his features overlapping perfectly with the evil ghost who had ruthlessly pillaged him in the dark. More importantly, that blood-soaked haute couture suit was exactly the same as the one hanging in Richard's closet. He's a half-beast. Peter lowered his voice from the side, his tone laced with a rare, heavy gravity. Under the dim light, Logan's trembling hands peeled back the man's shredded coat. Right above the torn flesh of his back, several black and gold feathers slick with moisture had ruthlessly broken through. It was the totem of a fierce bird of prey. Genetic atavism. The survival rate is incredibly low. Peter's brows knitted tightly. The Empire is currently purging beastmen with absolute ruthlessness. Should we notify the military? No. Logan instinctively fired back. After dragging this dying alpha back into the safe house, Logan slid down onto the freezing floor, utterly drained. Are you still going to get the abortion? Peter clutched the hem of his shirt, looking exactly like an abandoned hound. Yeah. Logan forced himself not to look at the lethally dangerous man on the bed. No. Hoarse, gravelly, and laced with an unquestionable command. It sounded exactly like the low, desperate roar of a cornered beast. The man on the bed actually propped up his crimson-stained body and sat up. Those heavily red, rimmed eyes locked dead onto Logan. Why? Logan let out a cold sneer. The man coughed up a splash of crimson. His chest heaved violently as his voice softened a fraction. I know. That child is mine. Has been good, hasn't he? Hasn't given you a hard time. The man tried to slow his tone. Have the baby. Hell be yours. I will never try to take him from you.
Oh!
So you just want a free air? Logan's fingertips dug into his palms, staring at him coldly. Believe it or not, I can use the Omega Protection Act to sue you into the ground. The man's eyes widened in sheer shock. Then, throwing all caution to the wind, he lunged forward. His crimson-stained arm ruthlessly pulled Logan into his embrace with an irresistible magnetism. I never said I wouldn't take responsibility. Nutrition, the absolute best care, cover it all. My wife and my child, I want both. That intensely possessive pheromone made Logan's body go instinctively soft, but he stubbornly turned his head away. I am not your wife. The man's body stiffened. Something utterly terrifying churned in the depths of his dark eyes. He ground his teeth, squeezing a single word through the gaps. Fine. In the very next second, the glare he threw at Peter practically materialized into a lethal meat grinder. 2 days later, desperate to fill his stomach, Logan risked a trip to the black market to trade for suppressants. He was far too naive. An alpha in rut was like an insatiable beast. For 2 days in that cramped room, the man had branded almost every single inch of Logan's skin with his inescapable scent. The black and gold feathers drifting throughout the room had inevitably clung to the hem of his clothes. He has beastman feathers on him. A piercing shriek tore through the chaotic noise of the black market. The crowd instantly exploded like boiling water. It's one of those ruthless beastman mongrels. These are the animals making us lose the front lines. Frenzied curses, rotting cabbage leaves, and even the ear-piercing barks of stray dogs. Woof, woof, woof. Dogs possessed sharp senses. What they smelled wasn't just the metallic tang of the feathers, but the quarter of apex predator bloodline growing right inside Logan's womb. Logan was shoved around, a sharp, spasmodic pain flaring in his lower abdomen. He backed away in despair, only to be tripped hard by someone unknown, falling straight toward the freezing concrete. The expected pain never came. A broad, rock-solid chest, radiating a familiar scent that sent violent shudders down his spine, caught him securely. Logan snapped his head up in a panic, his gaze crashing into a pair of impossibly cold, ruthless eyes. It was the exact same jacket he had mended with his own hands, the exact same style. Yet the owner of this body was taller, colder, and radiated an infinitely more destructive domination than the man in the safe house. 2 identical pheromones, a suffocating blend of freezing fur and gunpowder, crashed over Logan like a tsunami, completely drowning him. The surroundings fell dead silent. Then, an even more unbelievable scream erupted. Admiral Richard? No. Heza Beastman? Boom! Logan's brain exploded. The half-beastman he had treated as a thug was none other than the Empire's Supreme Admiral, who had stripped away every disguise during his frenzied rut. He knew Richard's most fatal secret. That ruthless alpha would absolutely silence him permanently. Pure terror utterly shredded his sanity. Logan turned and tried to flee. However, a large, sharply defined hand layered with rough gun calluses clamped onto his waist with effortless, iron-clad domination. That hand slid down his spine, ultimately cupping that slight curve with an absolute inescapable possessiveness. The touch felt like a venomous viper flicking its tongue, coiling directly around his lifeline. Richard lowered his head, his thin lips brushing against the shell of Logan's ear. His voice was deep and husky, carrying the eerie, twisted smirk of a demon crawling straight out of hell. Baby, where do you think you're going with my child? The familiar words felt exactly like a replay of that nightmare. Black and gold feathers danced frantically in the rain, completely blocking out the very last sliver of light in Logan's vision. Get out. Inside the cramped, narrow safe house, Logan bit his lower lip dead tight. His trembling fingertips pointed at the battered iron door, a desperate, crimson flush forced to the corners of his eyes. My place is too filthy to accommodate the great Admiral. The towering alpha pressed forward like an immovable wall of black iron. With his every approaching step, The old incandescent bulb overhead let out an overwhelmed screeching hum, the light flickering violently. The surrounding air felt as if it had been instantly frozen by absolute zero, radiating a visible, bone-chilling frost. Wife. Richard completely ignored that feeble resistance. His sharply defined, massive hand ruthlessly seized that fragile, trembling waist. Is playing dress-up fun for you? Logan struggled frantically, his eyes brimming with terror. The alpha lowered his head, admiring the breakdown of the person in his arms from an insurmountable height. A wicked curve hooked the corner of his mouth. Baby, you were crying so hard that night, you couldn't even catch your breath. Do you really think you could see my face? Even if I showed my true beast form, you wouldn't have remembered a thing anyway. A sudden deafening blast violently shredded this suffocating tension. The battered iron door was blasted into twisted scrap metal by a localized gravity field. Dozens of pitch, black plasma muzzles, accompanied by blinding infrared laser sights, clustered tightly onto Richard's chest. The lethal, military strike team flooded the room like freezing machines. A bone-deep chill shot up his spine, and Logan's pupils contracted violently. Acting almost entirely on pure instinct, that fragile, pregnant body took a sudden step forward. Throwing his arms wide, he stood dead between the fully armed military unit and the ruthless beast. Do you have an arrest warrant? His back crashed heavily into a scalding chest. Under the dead stare of dozens of lethal weapons, Richard actually let out a low, dark chuckle. Treating the entire strike team like thin air, he lowered his head. His thin lips precisely hunted down the Omega's fragile, sensitive nape gland, crushing down with heavy, absolute claim. The materialized, freezing frost surrounding him instantly exploded, transforming into chaotic, dark blades of wind that forced the front row of soldiers to stagger backward. Don't be afraid, baby. The Alpha's breath felt exactly like a devil's hex. You had the guts to try and cuckold your own husband. Aren't you supposed to be brave? Logan had no idea how Richard managed to secure a suspension of the investigation. Like a wild wolf dragging away its prey, he hauled Logan right back to his territory, the Williams estate. Then, he brought in a doctor to examine him. Under the silver-white surgical lights, the military doctor pushed up his gold-rimmed glasses. He pointed at the faintly trembling fetal heartbeat curve on the holographic projection. Extreme mental duress. Threatened miscarriage. Admiral, this is the very first case I have ever seen where a patient was driven to the brink of a miscarriage by their own alpha's intense domination. If you cannot rein in that terrifying aura, I strongly suggest replacing you with a milder alpha for his care. Richard's marble, carved face lost every last shred of temperature. The surrounding air instantly and violently warped under the sheer weight of his presence. The glass instruments in the medical room let out a resonant, deafening hum, pushed to the absolute edge of shattering. Suggest that again, and I will silence you permanently. Lying on the monitoring bed, even Logan's eyelashes trembled violently. Crushed beneath that tangible, materialized lethality, his vision went completely black as he plunged into a deep coma. Richard had Peter take care of Logan while he left, to undergo the investigation. The solemn Supreme Military Court and the quiet bedroom formed a highly tense, split, screen contrast at the exact same moment. In the bedroom, the young guard Peter clumsily fumbled with the nutrient solution. His awkward, comical movements finally drew the faintest trace of a smile across Logan's pale face. At that exact second, under the dim spotlight of the interrogation room, facing the lethal accusation of treason, Richard, locked into the tribunal chair by magnetic cuffs, didn't even bat an eyelid. Those highly aggressive pitch, black pupils were locked dead onto the surveillance feed popping up on his wrist terminal, an incredibly dangerous, dark gleam churning in the depths of his eyes. The terminal vibrated. Logan looked down. A message popped up on the screen carrying a ruthless, lethal edge. Smile at another man one more time, and after you give birth, I'm adding an extra round every single night. Logan's smile instantly froze on his face. Inside the interrogation room, facing the higher-ups' do or die threats, Richard finally raised his head slowly. A cruel, utterly disdainful smirk hooked the corner of his lips. Then go to hell. As for my bloodline, Go ask your direct superior about the Supreme Leader's little romantic scandals from back in the day. A crisis capable of overturning the entire regime was ruthlessly crushed by a few casually dropped top-tier scandals. It fractured into an overwhelming wave of virtual news debris, completely wiped from existence. Night fell heavy. The massive obsidian doors of the master bedroom were pushed open. Richard stood in the doorway, his military uniform, the ultimate symbol of absolute power, dusted with the cold dew of the freezing night. He stared dead at the Omega huddled tightly in the blankets. At the corners of his eyes, there was a rare, almost obsessive crimson flush. Wife, do you really not want me anymore? Logan gripped the edge of the blanket in a vice, his knuckles turning ghostly white, even his breathing trembling. I am scared of massive things. His terror of that ruthless beast was carved into his very bones. The Alpha closed the distance with terrifying speed. He seized that soft, trembling wrist, pressing it with irresistible magnetism against the side of his thigh. Through the crisp fabric of his military trousers, a highly dominant contour was roaring with extreme danger and feral hunger. Richard lowered his head, his voice devastatingly hoarse, dripping with a wicked, inescapable seduction. But you ain't afraid of this. You can overcome it, can't you? Logan's cheeks instantly exploded into a fiery red, the heat burning all the way to the tips of his ears. He tried to pull his hand back, but it was held in a death grip, completely immobilized. Ultimately, he could only melt in pure, humiliating submission, softening inch by inch into the Alpha's highly aggressive shadow. With crystal tears hanging from his eyelashes, he whispered, You have to kiss me first. Half a month later, Logan and Richard returned to meet his family. The Vice, leader of the Beastman Forest, Richard's Omega father, spoke. I heard your wife ran off with someone else? On a business trip, for 10 months. And your wife is 7 months pregnant? Truly, congratulations are in order. Lounging lazily in his half-beast form on the throne, like sofa, the Omega father played with his razor-sharp finger blades, not even bothering to look up. The air around Richard instantly filled with a dangerous, freezing frost. He fired back coldly. He came back to me on his own. And the child is mine. The father's movement paused. He turned his head to look at Logan, his gaze instantly filling with pity. Poor little thing. How did this tyrant get his claws into you? Couldn't even manage to run away? Watching this father and son duo who looked ready to draw guns and shoot each other at any second, and witnessing this utterly ruthless, affectionless daily life of the elite, Logan swallowed hard. He instinctively wrapped his arms tightly around his swelling belly. Lowering his completely flushed eyes, he let out a silent internal wail. Kid, in this man-eating insane asylum, it looks like you and I are the only normal ones left.
Richard and Logan's story ends here, and I absolutely love it. It's incredibly sweet and just fills you with a genuine sense of happiness. That moment when the broadcast blasted, Admiral, your wife ran off with another man, that was absolutely hilarious. However, maybe if Richard had told Logan earlier that he was a beast man, Logan wouldn't have run away. But then again, if Richard had revealed his identity the moment he returned, Logan might have run even faster. After all, back then, Logan was utterly terrified of beastmen. But that is exactly what makes the story so brilliant, knowing perfectly well that you are my absolute deepest fear, yet still falling for you uncontrollably. This kind of wide-awake surrender is probably exactly why everyone is so drawn to the enemies to lovers or natural predators falling in love tropes. I truly believe Logan's future will be incredibly happy. After all, he now has a lover with absolute, inescapable power and unimaginable wealth.